Who are you? Oh, it's Dylan. Hello. Okay, everyone, let's get started. This, in a lot of ways, this is going to be actually the most important series of lectures that we're going to do, which is our discussion about evolution, or more properly put, descent with modification. That is the truly correct way to refer to it. In fact, that's the way that Darwin always referred to it. Darwin never talked about evolution, except the very last word of his book on the origin of species. The very last word is evolution. But he always talked about descent with modification, which is a perfect summation of what we're going to talk about. We've led up to this by talking about the incredible complexity of cellular activities, but all the way through, we've also talked about the unity of life, how we share so many characteristics, even with what we regard as being the simplest of the organisms, like the prokaryotes. At the same time, we have to recognize this incredible diversity, especially when we look at morphology. We look at the diversity of living things on the planet. It is absolutely enormous. We have to try and find, in scientific terms, some way to reconcile both of those things. And this was the problem that besets scientists like Darwin, thinkers like Darwin, who observed this incredible diversity, at the same time recognized the unity of living things and wanted an actual explanation, but above all, wanted to understand a mechanism. They wanted to understand how. Now, we often think that Darwin was the first person to talk about evolution. He wasn't. Many, many people had talked about evolution before. Many people had tried to link living things in some sort of order and put the diversity that they saw in some understandable form, linking things by relationship. But nobody until Darwin and another scientist, Wallace, had anybody realized or explained a mechanism whereby this could happen. And that was the importance of Darwin and of Wallace, that they provided a mechanism. And it was not only a mechanism, it was a testable mechanism. We could test it by rigorous observation and later by experiment as well. So these are very important chapters for us to study. Just have a look here. This is an example of the sort of problem that Darwin examined. I don't know if you can even see it, but here there's a mantis, a praying mantis sitting. And this is an orchid mantis. And the orchid mantises are associated with particular groups of orchids, and they actually match the orchids pretty well. They're really difficult to see against the orchids. This is a Phalaenopsis orchid. The Phalaenopsis orchids have their own groups of orchid mantises. And this mantis, first of all, it's the right color. It's the same color as the flower. Its morphology is such that it actually blends in with the flower. And by doing that, it achieves two things. First of all, it's difficult to see. Its own predators are not going to be able to see it. But second of all, it is itself a predator. So it lies there camouflaged and it waits for insects to come in to the orchid, pollinate the orchid or do whatever, and it catches them. So it is exquisitely suited to its environment. In ecological terms, we would say it is occupying a very well-defined niche. It's at the same time, it is solidly tied to this orchid. It's somewhat limited, but it's superbly adapted to this orchid. You can't move this mantis to another set of plants because it would be obvious to predators. It would be obvious to its own prey. So somehow or other, we want to explain this in scientific terms. How did this happen? How did this mantis acquire these particular features? And that is the kind of problem that Darwin was so absorbed by. Here's another one. This is not in your textbook, by the way, but I always include this because this is such an incredible story. This is also an orchid. It's called Coryanthes, and it's also known as a bucket orchid. This is all one flower here. And at the bottom of it here, there is this like bucket shaped thing. It drips liquid into that bucket, fills it up to about here, like that. This whole part here, this here produces wax, and it's extremely slippery. All the reproductive parts are down here. So this orchid is only fertilized by one species of wasp. And here it is here, this little iridescent wasp. And this wasp uses wax, but it can't produce its own wax. It has to use wax from the orchid. It comes to the orchid to scrape wax off this here. And this is so smooth and slippery that frequently the wasp will fall and it'll land in the water here, in liquid rather, below here. And it can't, once it's wet, it can't fly. And it can't climb up the sides because they're too smooth. And there's only one way for this wasp to exit and escape, and that is through a tunnel here. And at the end of the tunnel, you can just see them there, are two sacs of pollen. And as the wasp, it has to wriggle really hard. It gets stuck in here. Actually, this actually closes a little bit to hold the wasp as it's trying to leave. And it holds it until the orchid has glued these pollen sacs to the head of the wasp. And once that happens, the orchid releases the wasp and it flies off with the pollen attached to it. So it's still got to go carry on, and it's got to gather wax elsewhere as well. So it wanders around with this pollen attached to it. It comes to another orchid which has already had its pollen stripped from it. Does the same thing because they're not very bright. It falls into the liquid again, still with its pollen attached to it, but now it escapes. Now this orchid, the second orchid it's gone to, has had its pollen taken already. The tunnel is open, and the wasp escapes through the same tunnel quite easily, but then it bumps into this here, and this clamps down. This part here is the stigma. It's the female part of the orchid, and it clamps down on the pollen sacs that the wasp is carrying. It scrapes them off as the wasp escapes. This is an incredible story. Only one insect can do this. Only one insect fits through on these things. Like other insects escape easily or bulldoze their way. If it's big enough, they bulldoze their way through. Only this one insect gets trapped like this and performs this intricate pollination mechanism. This is extraordinary. How did this arise? How did this relationship arise? How did this orchid develop this incredible form with its wax and its slippery sides and these pollen things that clamp down and stigmas that come down? And this is the sort of thing which, if you can't think of a mechanism for how these things arose, can drive you either crazy or drive you to belief. And that is exactly what happened with many of people who considered this kind of problem. To them, it was insoluble, and therefore the answer to it had to be miraculous. It was designed. Somebody designed it like that. For Darwin and those thinkers, that was not good enough, because the belief cannot be tested. And it cannot explain relationship very carefully, very clearly. This is what worried Darwin. He wondered about all of these things. He wondered about this diversity, and he wondered very much about how organisms became so closely adapted to their environment. How did that little wasp, how did it fertilize that orchid? How did it establish that relationship? How did the orchid establish the relationship with the little wasp? Despite that, Darwin recognized this incredible unity of things as well. He saw whether when you grouped things together, they are related to one another. The bees are related to the wasps, related to the ants, related to the other insects. He wanted to know what was it that was uniting everyone. Now we've learned that there's one overarching unity for all living things on our planet, and that is the central dogma, DNA. DNA is transcribed to messenger RNA, which is translated to protein. All living things obey that rule. So there is our central unity, but there's many other aspects of unity that we will recognize as well as we discuss it further.
Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
Speaking of Darwin, did you hear that a few of his manuscripts were stolen from Harvard?
Yes, and I'll in fact show you one of the most important ones was stolen. Not from Harvard, I think it's from Oxford.
Oh, it said Cambridge, so I figured it was.
I'm sorry, from Cambridge. Yes, no, it's Cambridge in England.
Okay.
Not Cambridge in Massachusetts. But yes, I heard that, and I'll show you an example. We'll see it in a minute. Yes, very sad. Who knows where they are? But the amazing thing, they were stolen 20 years ago, and nobody really noticed until now. So this was this book on the origin of species by Charles Darwin in 1859. It was the equivalent in the 19th century of the discovery of DNA in the 20th, because it exploded the field of biology. It lifted the field of biology from being an observational thing. Much of the knowledge that had been accumulated, a lot of knowledge has been accumulated about biology, but it was in the realm of natural history. It was purely observational. Once Darwin published On the Origin of Species and proposed a mechanism whereby both diversity and unity could be explained, the field of biology exploded, because now it became testable. What people observed now became truly scientific. It could be tested by further rigorous observation or by experiment. Darwin, however, his ideas had actually developed very, very slowly. He was a voracious reader, and he had accumulated a tremendous amount of book knowledge, which served as a basis for the development of his ideas. But he was a very good observer. So he saw things and attempted to explain them in terms of what he had learned from others. But there's another figure who's not ever talked about as much as Darwin, and that was this man, Alfred Wallace, who was working at much the same time as Darwin. And he was just working in the Far East. And so he was not a famous person, not well known, until the very end, when he produced work and he actually consulted with Darwin, and they together presented the ideas that we're going to hear about. So there had been a long history of natural history observation and of attempts to explain what people saw. But it was only in the late 18th century and the 19th century that it began to move away from sheer belief, religious ideas about how we originated and everything, to scientific ideas. And many of them were very, very contentious, very, very much disputed. For example, this man here, Hutton, in 1790, he is regarded as being one of the earliest of the geologists. He proposed that, in fact, the Earth, the changes to the Earth occurred very, very slowly, and that they could be observed, that the effects of change could be observed. But when we looked at things like the layers of rock in a mountain or whatever, what we were looking at was things that had happened over a long period of time. The prevailing idea at this time was that the Earth was about 6,000 years old, that it had been created entire, that as it was, excuse me, and that things like that they did observe, like for instance, layers of rock, sedimentary rock. Just excuse me one minute. Things like sedimentary rock, that sort of thing, was a result of cataclysms like the biblical flood. And Hutton did not believe this. Hutton believed that the world was old, and that the changes which occurred in the Earth occurred very, very slowly. This is really important for Darwin. There were a number of other thinkers that influenced him. One in particular we'll hear about is Malthus, because Malthus was a mathematician who suggested that species existed, especially the humans, existed in competition with one another for resources. It was another important idea for Darwin. A lot of people were talking about evolution, started talking, especially under the influence of Hutton. They started to think, well, maybe species changed. Maybe the species that we saw now weren't the species that had always been there. Maybe they had arisen from other. But unfortunately, here comes one person. This is Lamarck. And Lamarck proposed that indeed species did change, but that they changed through influence of what they did. So, for example, if they used a limb, the limb would get bigger and bigger and more powerful. And when they had progeny, the progeny would inherit big, strong limbs. If they were diggers, for example, if they dug, they get strong front legs to dig and dig and dig. And their offspring would have big legs because parents had big legs. Well, unfortunately, there's no mechanism for progeny to acquire acquired characteristics. But Lamarck didn't, and other scientists didn't see it like that. And this became a very popular idea. Giraffes, for example, got long necks because they stretched their necks to eat leaves higher up the tree. The shorter giraffes had eaten everything down below. And they're the ones with long necks because they stretched the whole time. Their progeny had long necks. They acquired the characteristic. Of course, there's no mechanism for that. There's no mechanism to hand on acquired characteristics. In 1830, this incredibly important book, The Principles of Geology, was published. And this was one of the most important influences on Darwin of all, because the Principles of Geology took you out into the field and showed you how strata of rock had been laid down, suggested that Hutton's idea of gradualism was true. The Earth was very, very old. Geological processes happen very, very slowly. They do not happen as the layers of rock, for example, are built up very slowly. They don't happen as a result of floods and things like that. All of these things were going to influence Darwin. But most important of all is this man here, is Cuvier, who was the founder of the science of paleontology, the science of studying fossils. And this had an enormous influence on Darwin because he believed that by looking at fossils, we were looking at a history of biology. We were looking at a history of species. Okay, so we'll repeat some of that in a while, but be aware that before Darwin, there were many other scientists, or at least natural historians and people who had thought about these things. Darwin is going to come up and he's going to propose a mechanism whereby all of these things can happen. But let's just do some observations of our own. Let's go back to the mantises and look at them as a group. They occur all over the world. They are insects. They belong to this order called the Mantodia. Very, very diverse. And here are some of them. So we see these really florid ones.
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
It's illegal to kill one, right?
I don't know that it's illegal. Certainly some of them are endangered. And there's no reason to kill them. I don't know if it's illegal, strictly speaking, but it may be. They may be protected. I don't know.
In New York,
I will tell you one thing about them. They have become very, very popular in the pet trade, and some of them are quite difficult to breed. So they are collected in the wild, and that may well be illegal. That may well be illegal.
No, yeah, because I read up on something. They said it's illegal to kill them in New York.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's good.
No, yeah, because they're very limited here. So.
I'm glad to hear it. That they are protected.
Don't they eat pests?
Yeah.
Yes. They're very, very voracious predators. That's one thing that they all have in common. They're all voracious predators, and they all have these raptorial arms at the front that they catch their prey with. That's one of the things that unites the whole group. The second thing is they have these very distinctive head with these bulging eyes with incredibly good eyesight. Their ability to resolve images is much better than ours. They also have this unusual for insects. They're able to turn their heads very widely in many directions, very, very flexible. But apart from that, just look at the difference between them. Look at the difference in the shapes. Look at the difference in, this is a desert mantis here. This is the orchid mantis that we saw earlier. This is this is kind of a generic one you'd find in your garden, probably. The green coloration, green camouflage. Yeah. And this one is another of I believe, a tropical mantis. And very, very diverse. And yet, when we look at them, we see that they're all recognizably mantis. There's something there which is uniting them all. And this was Darwin's fascination. He came to the conclusion that their similarities to one another are because they share a common ancestor. There is somewhere in their history, in their geological time history, they shared an ancestor. And after that ancestor, they diverged into these different forms. It was a revolutionary idea, but it was one that took him an awful long time to develop and to put into words and put down on paper.
Wait, so Professor?
Yes.
Wouldn't it be like the same process as like humans? Because at one point we all came from like the same ancestors, but
Exactly.
by mantises, they technically came from the same ancestors. So of course they're gonna be different because as time goes on, like they mutate into different looks and
Exactly.
styles. Same thing with us though. Like we
Correct.
we all don't look the same, and we're all technically genetically different because we all have different codes in our DNA.
Correct. Exactly. And it's all because of adaptation. And it's adaptation to changes in environment and all of this. But environment can mean many, many things. There can be many things that influence. But this was what Darwin, this was his inkling, was that there was a common ancestor, but then after that common ancestor, there had been divergence. And the divergence is adaptation. It's adaptation for life in a specific environment. And if the environment changes, that in itself can lead to further diversification. And here's what here it is perfectly expressed. They have lots of shared characteristics. They're all mantises. So, and that demonstrates the unity, but they have diverse adaptations. And those diverse adaptations are adaptations to their specific environment, to the particular things that drive their living. So, for example, have a look here. This is our orchid mantis. Here's the desert mantis. And we've got to ask the question. They're both mantises, but could this mantis survive on an orchid? It wouldn't last very long because it'd be very, very obvious. It'd be picked off by a bird or something before long. Could this mantis survive in the desert? Absolutely not. First of all, look at its coloration, its shape, everything else, but consider that this mantis is adapted to a dry environment where there's very little water. Take our tropical mantis there, and it will die from lack of water very quickly. They have adapted. They've adapted to specific environments. And in some cases, those environments are incredibly specific. A particular flower, a particular type of habitat, etc. This is now what Darwin is attempting to derive a mechanism for. So, and he summarized it as saying that this was descent, in other words, from a common ancestor, but that after that common ancestor, populations became modified. And the modification could become so extreme that we would recognize them as being recognizably different or even different species. So now evolution refers to the process whereby species accumulate difference from their ancestors over time to adapt to specific environmental conditions. And Darwin had the advantage that he rejected the idea that the Earth was only 6,000 years old. He looked at Hutton's work and at Lyell, and he realized that these processes only had to take place very, very slowly. He had no idea about the overall age of the Earth, which is just about 4 billion years. But he was aware of the fact that these processes would have taken place over a very long time. He saw, for example, that the fossil record went back very far, millions of years.
Wait, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
So how can one say that the Earth was only what you said 4,000 years old?
6,000 they thought it was.
Oh, so wait, how could they say that the Earth was 6,000 years old, but there's been animals on this planet that's been here for millions of years?
Because the person who derived the 6,000 year age derived it from biblical
So they went by religion, basically. They went by the Bible and stuff.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes. He looked at things like Genesis and everything, and worked out that the Earth was, in fact, he worked it out. I forget the exact age, but he worked it out down to the time. He said the Earth, the first step in creation of the Earth was like at 9 o'clock on such and such a date, 6,000 years before.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yeah.
Is this about Charles Darwin, the one that did an experiment on the birds on the island?
Correct. You're going to hear about it. Yeah. Yeah. It was that was one of the observations which really solidified the idea for him. And we still use it as an example. That's exactly correct.
Professor?
Yeah.
When you were talking about fossils, was he also the one that confirmed the theory about Pangea, because certain countries had like similar fossils they were finding?
Yeah. He knew nothing about continental drift, and I think that he would have been astonished if you discussed it, because in fact that idea is a very modern one. But Darwin very definitely noticed that living things on different continents bore similarity to one another, and he never went there. He never tried to explain why. That was way beyond his or anybody's geological knowledge or anything at the time. But it was observed, for example, that the southern continents, Southern Africa, Australia, and South America, had many things in common with one another. They had many groups of plants that were unique to the southern continents. For example, I'll show you in a while. And so that interested him, but he had no way to explain it. That was simply because they didn't understand the structure of the inner Earth. It was only in the 20th century when we began to understand the layering, the geological layering of the Earth, that a mechanism for continental movement could be proposed. As far as Darwin was concerned, really, the continents were fixed. So he would have had difficulty explaining those kinds of things, like Pangea. That waited for the 20th century. Okay, so in general, this summarizes his idea. We've used the mantises as our example. There's an ancestor, an ancient common ancestor, a primordial mantis. For some reason or another, the population of the ancestral mantis maybe got separated from one another into separate populations, which got subjected to different environmental conditions. Remember, this is taking place over millions and millions of years. Slowly, 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 the populations adapt, and they adapt so radically that we recognize them as being different species. And when we look at them, these populations have very, very different relationships to their environment, which they've developed over a long period of time, and which has separated them now, one from the other. We recognize unity because they share a common ancestor, but they are very different from one another because each of them has become modified in a different way. They have descended from a common ancestor, and they have become modified. They have accumulated differences from one another. And so this is Darwin's central idea, but it took him a very long time to reach it, and an awful lot of observation, as I'll explain. So we can, in summary, we can look at evolution as we see it as a pattern. When we arrange living things, we try and organize them, we classify them, we can see that they have a relationship to one another. That's the pattern. But evolution is also a process. It's an ongoing process. And we can examine that process if we look at how things have changed with time. If we don't look at things, we don't look at our populations as being fixed entities. We look at them as having had an evolutionary history, and we ask, what is that? What is the likely history? And what are the mechanisms which could produce the changes that we observe? So there's some history of the earlier thinkers. Human beings, unfortunately, have a tendency to latch onto ideas and then not want to let go of them. And so sometimes very good ideas, original ideas, act as an anchor rather than a spur to further development. What I mean by that is, look, for example, at the Greek philosopher Aristotle, lived 400 years before the Christian era. He was one of the philosophers who looked at the living world and tried to explain what he saw, but what he saw, he thought was fixed. He didn't believe that species could change or anything like that. But he still wanted to try and explain how they were related to one another. And so he arranged things as he saw it in order, from simplest to the most complex. And naturally, as human beings have done for millennia, human beings were placed at the top of the chain. So he regarded, in terms of the world he saw around him, that human beings were the most advanced of all the living things. And everything else was on some sort of a scale below that. Now, as an early observation, that was okay because it allowed people to put things into some sort of order. But unfortunately, it became a fixture in thinking. And in fact, it became a fixture in religious thinking too. They often required that people adhere to Aristotelian thinking. Any variance from that was regarded as heresy. But by the 1700s, people were starting to realize that organisms were adapted for particular purposes. And they want to know, and that just interested them, that organisms could do something very particular. They seemed to be, or in a way, often they were limited to a very narrow environment because they did one thing very, very well, for example. That kind of interested them. But it was explained in Aristotelian terms. Things were fixed. They were what they were. It is as it is. And the only way to explain that was to say this was by design. Somebody had designed things to be, somebody designed that pink mantis to sit on the pink orchid. They thought it out, and this was the idea of creationism. And creationism dominated scientific thinking for a very, very, very long time. In fact, it's still many people allowed to dominate their thinking. We still encounter it. This scientist here, Carl Linnaeus, was one of the first to systematically go through everything that he could that was alive and try to describe it in a way where he related one thing to another. So he began to group things. He decided that the unit for living things was the species. So, for example, human beings, we are Homo sapiens. He described everything with a genus name. Our genus name is Homo, and a specific name, sapiens. So, in fact, there's now only one species of Homo on the planet. It's Homo sapiens. But we, in our past, have had several species of Homo. There have been all sorts of Homo neanderthalensis, Homo erectus. There were other species. He didn't know anything about that. But if Linnaeus looked at the mantises, for example, he probably would have called all the mantises by one genus name. And then he would have assigned each of those that looked different, he would have assigned a different specific name. And this is still a system that we use now in science, and it's called the binomial format. So every living thing is assigned a genus name, and it's assigned a species name. And thereafter, above the species name, every name, the genus name, and every other association we make attempts to group things by similarity. So if we were to look at human beings, we would group human beings with the great apes. And then we would group the great apes together with all the other simians, the monkeys and everything else. Then we could group all of that. We could group them with the mammals, we could, et cetera, et cetera. So Linnaeus saw things in terms of these expanding groups that enclosed more and more and more. It was very important because it placed an order on the he still adhered to the Aristotelian idea that everything was just fixed, but he wanted to explain the two things: the diversity he saw, but then also why were things similar to one another. He put them together where he saw similarity, but he made clear where he saw difference. And for biologists at the time, that was a very, very important observation. And it's still a system that we use. Darwin knew all about Linnaeus. In fact, Darwin was a very good naturalist, and he collected masses and masses of animals, and he used to classify them, and using the Linnaean system, put them together, describe new species, or put them into families, group them together, etc., etc. But he was also very interested in geology and in fossils. And he recognized that when you looked at rock strata, for example, when you looked at layers of sediment that had been laid down and then been compacted into rock, there was something very important that he learned from Hutton and from Lyell. It sounds so simple, but it was revolutionary. And that is rock strata at the bottom here. Here's, for example, here's a river flooding out onto the continental shelf, for example, and it's bringing down sediment. It brings down sediments, it wears down mountains behind here very, very slowly. That idea in itself was revolutionary. It brings that sediment down and it lays it in layers slowly. It builds up these layers, but there's an obvious implication, and that is that the layers which are lower down are older than the layers which are up near the top. So this was revolutionary because the 6,000-year-old Earth people said all of this was laid down at the same time during the flood. It wasn't laid down gradually. But that gentleman, Cuvier, that I told you about, the first paleontologist, he observed something else. He saw that fossils which occurred down here, in these rocks down here, were different to fossils that occurred up here. And the fossils that occurred up here were more similar to living things walking around on the land than these fossils down here. Cuvier also noticed, and Darwin really took this to heart, that many, many, many animals which were fossilized down here, there were many species of animal that went extinct. Not everything survived. Many things went extinct. In fact, extinction is the order of the day. It's the rule. Most things eventually go extinct. They go extinct, but they leave a legacy. And the legacy is in new species that succeed them. So this really impressed Darwin.
Professor,
Because yes, go ahead.
did they also track the levels of carbon in these different layers of, no?
No, no. They had none of those mechanisms. They had none of that science available to them. They were limited strictly to observation. They just saw these things if they wanted to see them. They went out and looked for them, but no, they had none of that advanced science available to them. So they had none of those confirming things about the dates or anything like that. All that Darwin knew was that these bottom sediments here were probably very, very old. He said millions of years, but they're actually often hundreds of millions of years. So he knew these down here very, very old. These are more recent, but still old. And he was fascinated by the fact that species changed as you look through these strata. You could link them together because they have similarities, but the ones up here differed from those down here. And in some cases, up here, there were living relatives who still differed, but were still extant, were still living.
Wait, so Professor,
Yes,
can you go back to that picture for 1 second?
sure.
So you're saying the rocks at the lower levels of it, you said that there was like extinct animals and stuff there, like the fossils.
Correct.
And
Correct.
Also, I actually just looked something up as you were just talking. They said they found like extinct animals such as like dodo birds and what's the other one? Like a woolly mammoth, I think it was, or something like that.
Uh-huh.
They found that those like fossils lower in the ground than, because like right now you can't really find those fossils like on like the first 1 or 2 layers, but
Correct.
you go, like you'll probably find more ancient fossils about it. That's what I
Correct.
was reading on the internet while you were just talking. I was
Yeah.
reading up the article about that.
Yeah. Yes. There are many there are many entire groups of animals and plants that are in these lower layers, for example, where they're completely missing from up here. So that was fascinating to Darwin. He wanted to know what had happened to them. Now the creationists said that, well, they got wiped out in the flood, which is an explanation. And if you are a religious person, and as many people then were, even the scientists were very, very religious, devout. That was an explanation. But if you had a scientific mind, you would want to know what is that. That can't be, because if this was all from the flood, they'd all be mixed up. They're not. They're in some sort of order here. They did try to make some like that. Some things got wiped out early in the flood, or that the flood was longer than the Bible says, etc., etc. But those who were paying attention to the geology and strictly scientific thinking about it realized this process here had taken place over millions of years. And changes in the species through that time could also be very, very slow. These changes could be accumulated extremely slowly until we see what is around us today. So I have to tell you that Cuvier, the first paleontologist, he looked at this, and he still believed the 6,000 year Earth kind of idea, and he believed that each of these was a result of a separate flood, and that species died out by catastrophe. So he thought the reason they changed as you went up was these guys had been living, and they were wiped out by a flood and fossilized. And then the land that whatever that they lived on was now cleared of animals. Other animals came in from outside and settled it, and they were different. And they got wiped out by another catastrophe. So they looked different in this layer. Then that got replaced by other animals coming in. Cuvier did not think of these populations as being ancestral to the ones above, which is what Darwin's insight was. He believed that we could be looking in these low layers at ancestors of things which appeared in the upper layers. And that was beyond revolutionary. That was heresy, because it said species change. Species change, they adapt. Then and their descendants acquire modifications. So this is just basically a summary of what I've told you. Here's a mention of Lamarck. Unfortunately, poor old Lamarck, he has ended up being a rude word in science because of this idea that he had to try, and he accepted that species change. He accepted the idea that species evolve, that as you look through geological time, we see changes in species. But he explained it by this mechanism of acquired modification, so that a body part that got much used got developed, body parts that were not used withered away and were lost, and progeny inherited acquired characteristics. But there is no way to support this. I mean, there's 1,000 examples of this in human history. For example, I quite like the one they use in your text of the bonsai trees. Some of these bonsai trees in Japan are hundreds of years old, and they've been artificially reduced in size and everything by continually clipping their roots, by continually pruning the branches, etc. And they dwarf trees, but they flower. And if you collect their seed and you plant their seed, you don't grow dwarf trees, you grow normal-sized trees. And the reason for that is there's no way that you can alter the genetics by artificially altering the form in this way. So just give you a little history of Darwin himself, because he's such a fascinating character. He was really a person who really stumbled through his adolescence and his early manhood. He was very, very interested in nature. He came from a very good family. They were actually a family of scientists. Many of his relatives were all in their own way very reputable scientists. His father was a doctor, and they were very, very wealthy. They had money apart from that. But he was the youngest son. He didn't stand to inherit much. And all that seemed to interest him was nature. He didn't have very good idea about what he wanted to do with his life. So he was sent off to Scotland to study medicine, which he absolutely hated. He hated it with a passion. And he basically dropped out, had a fight with his family, and then they sort of threatened to cut him off without a penny. And he agreed to study theology at Cambridge. But this period that he spent in Scotland was very important, because that's where he encountered the work of Hutton and Lyell, the geologists, and that stayed with him. So he switched to theology. He never really became a pastor or anything, but he did graduate with a degree from Cambridge University, and he didn't want to be a pastor. So he was again at a loose end, and his family were desperate. And a family friend or something, arranged for him to take a position as a naturalist on this ship that was going to go and sail around all the way around the world. It was a tiny ship, and it had a captain who was a real snob. And this captain was not only a snob, he was also depressive. And he wanted a companion to talk to, on this voyage. But he was too much of a snob to talk to his crew. So he persuaded the them to employ Darwin as his companion. And he got this job as a naturalist. And he was supposed to basically entertain the captain for 5 years, which didn't last long. They ended up fighting bitterly. But he stuck it out, very, very brave. He was violently seasick, and he remained seasick for the entire voyage. But here's how the Beagle sailed. It went all the way around the world. It went from Europe. It sailed around South America, then to Australia, then around South Africa, and then back to Britain. 5-year voyage, a tiny vessel, seasick all the way, and for half the time he was fighting with the captain. So it had its drawbacks. But all the way along, he frantically collected specimens, made as many observations as he could. As soon as he hit land, he would go walking, hiking, climbing, collecting everywhere, and sending stuff. He would send stuff back to Britain. It's here in South America that suddenly all of his ideas came together in a way. Still took him a long time to write it all up, but it was here that his ideas became crystallized for many reasons. First of all, as he went up, we'll just take this as an example. As he went up the west coast of South America, he made several observations. First of all, he went climbing up in the mountains in the Andes, and right up near, high up in the Andes, he discovered the remains of coral reefs, fossilized, now raised up into some of the highest mountains in the world. While he was in South America, however, he also experienced an earthquake. And he saw, after that earthquake, that land was actually lifted. And he reasoned that the Andes had actually been lifted by earthquake activity, by geologic activity over the eons from sea level to these immense mountains, carrying with them the fossils that had originated. So that was, for him, a living demonstration of Lyell and Hutton's observations. Second of all, he collected a lot of animals here. He also collected and observed fossils, which people had. And he saw, for example, I think I've got an example here. This was one of the things he observed. He saw fossils of these. These are called the glyptodonts. And he saw fossils of the glyptodonts, but he also saw armadillos, living armadillos. The glyptodonts long since extinct, I think about 10 million years ago. Living armadillos, though, bear a strong resemblance to the fossils. So that fascinated him. He also saw many animals for the first time ever. I'll just flip forward a little bit. He saw these iguanas throughout South America. And he liked them very much. He did a lot of observations and collecting of iguanas. And he also saw many birds that he'd never seen before, and identified on the west coast of South America. But then he ended up sailing to the Galapagos Islands, which are off the coast of South America. And the first thing he realized was that the Galapagos Islands are volcanic islands. They are relatively young. They're not made of sedimentary material which has been raised up. They are volcanic material which has erupted from the seafloor. So they are much, much younger than the mainland. That was observation number one. The second observation he made was he was fascinated by the fact that the animals that he saw on the Galapagos were very similar to animals he'd seen on the mainland, but they were different. They were substantially different. He observed, you already said, right, about the birds, the finches especially. That was one group of birds that he observed. He'd seen finches on the west coast of South America, and they were very ordinary little birds with a limited habitat range. when he came to the Galapagos, he saw finches of many different kinds. Many different kinds. Some of them more closely resembled the mainland ones than others, but some of them were highly adapted to specific environments on the Galapagos. Some of them, for example, were unique to particular islands. He also looked at the tortoises, and he saw that tortoises, for example, were giants, where tortoises on the mainland were all small. Tortoises on the islands were giants, and they differed from island to island. So that interested him. He reasoned the Galapagos are much younger than the mainland. So what has happened is the Galapagos arose. It had no animals or plants. Animals and plants arrived from the mainland. They colonized the Galapagos Islands, and over a long period of time, they adapted to specific habitats on the islands. They had to make their way as well as they possibly could. So he's already glimmering, he's got this glimmering idea that there's some mechanism driving them, but he doesn't quite know what it is. And for that, he has to concentrate on this idea that they have adapted. But why? Why is it that one species landing on the Galapagos diverges? Why is it that they begin adapting to these specific habitats? We have a finch arrives from the mainland, lands on the Galapagos. Why doesn't it just colonize the whole of the Galapagos and stay the same as ever it did? What are they adapting to? Why are they adapting in this way? Now he's got to go to somebody. I'll just show you some of them. Here is just a few. There are many species of finch on the Galapagos. But here, for example, here's one that specializes in eating cactus. Here is another one which specializes in insect eating. Look at the difference in the beak shape.
Professor, they don't
Yes.
actually eat the cactus, they eat the cactus fruit, right?
Yes, sorry, yeah. That you know there is one that actually eats leaf as well, I believe, or the cactus body itself as well.
How do they
think
eat,
this,
how do they eat it if it's like it has those rough points? I mean, I see that it does have a refined beak, but still, I mean, aren't they going to be a little tough on digestion?
I don't know. That I don't know. But they probably have a way of cleaning the spines off before they dig into the flesh of the plant itself. You can see the difference in the beak shapes. And then there are seed eaters with these great big heavy beaks, but it's even more than that. There are also different kinds of seed eaters. There are some which eat soft seeds. There's others which eat tough seeds, as we'll hear in a while. There are many. There are these distinct species, but it is obvious that they have arisen from a common ancestor. They still share many of the finch-like characters. He also saw that the iguanas that had fascinated him on the mainland, here they were on the Galapagos, but they were no longer climbing trees and eating leaves and flowers the way the iguanas that on the mainland he had done. Here in the Galapagos, they are these great big heavy set animals with these very, very strong jaws, and they are very agile swimmers, and they are marine, and they eat seaweed. They've adapted to eating seaweed. So there was an ancestral iguana, which must have landed, and its progeny, its descendants rather, ended up eating seaweed. Why? Why go for seaweed? Well, for all of these ideas, just let me flip. I just want to flip to something here. He depended on an idea from a man called Malthus. I thought I had Malthus's graph here, but I don't. Malthus was a mathematician, and Malthus suggested that he looked at human beings in particular, and he looked at human population and saw human population grew exponentially, which in a free growing population, that is what happens. It grows pretty much exponentially. A two couple give rise to 4 children, they give rise to 8 children, etc., 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 and the population grows exponentially. But Malthus observed that resources, the stuff that, for example, the farmland could produce, grew geometrically. It grew as a straight line, not as exponential. And there is a point at which the human population outstrips the resources that can supply it. And that point where the human population outstrips the resources is what interested Darwin very much, because then people begin competing with one another for a resource. They begin competing. Where a resource becomes limiting, the population starts to compete with one another. And suddenly Darwin had his answer. Now he could suggest a mechanism why these adaptations arose. For example, I suggested, why didn't the finch, the ancestral finch, simply colonize the Galapagos and just remain like that? Well, the answer is because they could do that for a time. The population of finches could increase, but very soon, the Galapagos is a semi-arid environment. Food is limited, and they would very soon use up their resources, and they would begin competing with one another for the resource. Now we have a situation where if one of those in the genetics somewhere, there's variability in the population. If one of them has a slight advantage, one of them can eat harder seed that the others can't eat. The one that eats hard seed survives better. It produces more progeny, but guess what? Its progeny inherit the ability to eat hard seed. And that starts to force that little group to start diverging from the main population. And Darwin suddenly realized this provides the mechanism. First of all, that there's variability in a population. Populations are not uniform. Second of all, some of them might have a slight advantage. Those that have an advantage are able to survive better, reproduce more, and their progeny inherit the advantageous characteristic, and their population begins to diverge from the rest. At the same time, they are carving themselves out a niche. They are specializing in using something maybe that the others are not. He began to see confirmation of this all over the Galapagos. He saw, first of all, he looked at the birds, saw how the birds were specialized to particular microhabitats, if you want to call them that. He saw how animals on the different islands differed from one another because they'd been separated geographically and in time and had accumulated differences. And this all confirmed for him the Galapagos had been colonized from the mainland, and all of the change, all the new species and everything that he observed on the Galapagos had arisen since those original colonizations had taken place. Let me just flip. I've covered some of the stuff. All right. So Darwin eventually ended up back in Britain, and he carried on going through his collections. He carried on working, but he really did not do anything much about publishing anything or making his ideas really well known. He did speak to some of his friends, but he was very, very scared about what he was suggesting. He remained religious for his whole life, and he had tremendous respect for the church and everything. And he knew that what he was about to tell people, suggest to people, was absolutely heretical. And that was that species we observe around us have descended with modification from earlier ancestry. As soon as you say that, you're talking also about human beings as animals. You're talking about us having descended from something else. And our very obvious closest relatives are the apes. And he knew that this idea was not going to go down well, no matter how much he believed in it. He did write down, he did compile everything. He worked on many different things, as I'll show you in a minute. But it was only in 1858 that this scientist, Alfred Wallace, corresponded with him and sent him a manuscript saying exactly the same thing as Darwin was saying, but derived from his studies of the animals of Indonesia. And Darwin realized if he didn't do something, he was going to be scooped, and he didn't want that. He was still quite ambitious, so he agreed with Wallace. They both went to the Linnean Society of London, the leading scientific society, and presented their ideas and their findings. It caused an absolute uproar, but he then hurriedly wrote his seminal work on the origin of species, and he published it the next year. And although it caused such a tremendous uproar, it caused a huge reaction from the religious community, and within a decade or so, scientists of any repute actually accepted, first of all, the evolution that they had talked about before and observed. Darwin now gave them the mechanism for it. And
Sir?
Yes, go ahead.
He survived to see that his work being accepted?
Yes. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. He didn't live, he was a very strange person. He was a very reclusive, and there's a lot of suggestion that he sounds like a hypochondriac. He's always complaining. He's always complaining about his stomach and all sorts of things, his liver, and there's many people believe he actually acquired a disease in South America called Chagas disease, which produces a chronic condition of fatigue and depression and all sorts of things. But he still continued to work, and he still continued to publish. Once he'd published on the origin of species, he published several other works as well. And some of them specifically addressed human evolution. And this is the term which is most closely associated with Darwin, and that is this word here, natural selection. What he's suggesting is that in nature, certain groups are selected for and others are selected against. The ones who are selected for are those who do better in their environment, have more young, and pass more of those advantageous genes on to their young. That is the system of natural selection. I'll show you why he was so careful about naming it in a minute. And his ideas explained everything. They explain everything that we know about biology. And it's been said that biology is incomprehensible without considering descent with modification, without considering Darwin's formulation of evolution. Okay, so I want to show you that you said you talked about the notebooks which had been stolen. Well, unfortunately, in those notebooks that have disappeared, there is this little tiny diagram, which is, it has been said that this is the most important diagram in biology, apart from Watson and Crick's diagram of the structure of DNA, because this perfectly summarizes Darwin's ideas about descent with modification. What he's showing here is a tree of life, that everything is related. Here, in fact, posits an ancestor right at the very beginning, a single ancestor. And that from that ancestor, that everything else has descended. It is descended not in a straight line, but in branches. From one ancestor, several lines of descent can arise. Some of them end in extinction. Many of them end in extinction. So, for example, if we look here, this whole group here has arisen from a common ancestor, but all of them have become extinct. Others that have arisen from a common ancestor, like this here, remain extant. They remain living. Many of the groups, if we look at them carefully enough, will find that they are extensive and that they contain extinct members and they contain living members as well. And these here look very different to one another. They may be quite divergent from one another. We know these can even be on separate continents to one another, but they are united by having had a common ancestor somewhere in the past. And that is what provides the unification that we observe. So, and the thing I like most about this all is this little statement up here, I think. And then this little doodle that we now recognize, and scientists who work in molecular biology or whatever, recognize this absolutely, because this is exactly how we now link living things to one another. So Darwin was also very keen on using fossil evidence to link living groups as well. And one of the groups, there are a couple of animal groups which are particularly well explained by using this technique. And one of them is the elephants. The elephants is rather like this group here. And accepting that we have living members who are very, very different to the living elephants. But in between, there are many, many extinct forms which link these different disparate groups. This group here, first of all, let's say, for all of the elephants here, there is one common ancestor. For all of the elephant groups which have lived, we recognize one common ancestor. Closer probably to the common ancestor than anything else are these strange groups here. The hyraxes, also called the rock rabbits, largely African and Asian. They are very look very rabbit-like, except they have little tiny ears. And they actually, surprisingly enough, have little tiny tusks as well. So those are the hyraxes. There are several different species of them. Then the other group, which are allied to the elephants, are the Sirenians. Those are the manatees and their relatives. Now, these links were established by morphology. They share morphological, anatomical features with the elephants, which link them, and that's been recognized for a long time. But in addition, we can now look at the structure of their DNA. We can look at the sequence of their DNA, and we come out with very much the same pattern. So these evolutionary ideas are borne out by observation, but they're borne out by very careful observation, for instance, of the DNA structure. These here, a variety of fossil forms of elephants, and some of them actually survived right into the period, like tens of thousands of years ago. And that would be like this, for example, a Mammuthus, which is the mammoth. There were American mammoths and also Asian mammoths as well. Mammoth was one of the Asian mammoths. So these species survived well into the period of the human evolution. But these three here are the only living ones. And that's this Loxodonta africana, that's the common African elephant. This is the Asian elephant. This is a less common species of African elephant. When we just look at them, we look at what's alive today. We try to be Aristotle. We look at what's alive today. It'd be very difficult to prove any association between the hyraxes, the manatees, and these. But when we look at all of the evidence, when we look at all of the fossil intervening fossil evidence, when we look at the molecular evidence, for example, this is clearly a substantially correct grouping, all arising from a common ancestor, descending with modification into radically different environments and producing the range of forms that we see both in the fossil record and living. The other group for which it's very well established are the horses. I'll just mention that. I'm not going to go into it in detail. But the horses also have a very good fossil record which shows us of their evolution. And I think that I'll need to leave it there for the moment. Do you have any questions?
Yes. Are we going to have a quiz this week on Wednesday?
Gosh, you know, I've completely forgotten about it. Why don't we miss the quiz this week and we'll do one next week? How's that?
That sounds lovely.
I thought you'd like that. It's getting, I know it's getting very pressured for you all. So that's all right. We'll have a quiz next week. It'll be the final quiz next week, and just be one short quiz before your final exam. Okay.
Yeah, and then also I wanted to ask you something after class, if you don't mind.
Oh dear.
If you're not busy, that's fine.
No, I'm not busy. I'm just, I just need to try and remember how we did it last time. In any case, okay, yes, I'll send you. I'll try and set up a meeting and I'll email you. But you remember, I completely boxed it up the last time.
Yeah, it's okay. We'll try it again. It's no big deal.
Okay, all right. Okay then. I'll email you a meeting number. All right. Anybody else?
Thank you, Professor.
That's a pleasure.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Have a good day.
You too.
Goodbye, Professor.